So Jennifer Wightman is a research specialist in the section of soil and crop sciences at Cornell University. For 20 years, she has analyzed the greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation sources and sinks from agriculture, forestry, waste, and renewable energy systems. She feels strongly that greenhouse gas reduction is the ultimate adaptation and resiliency effort to ensure future farms and landowners have a less variable climate in which to work. To this end, she has worked closely with farm and landowner nonprofits and outreach organizations to develop local strategies around greenhouse gas mitigation. She's worked with state agencies to develop policies and tools to support farms and landowners to implement greenhouse gas mitigation projects. And she's worked with international undergraduate and graduate students to design a more sustainable future by understanding the life cycle and environmental impact of any product or system they build. Currently, she is working on a New York State funded greenhouse gas inventory, mitigation, and developing future scenarios for agriculture. This is intended to establish a baseline of emissions to identify real, permanent, and verifiable mitigation opportunities, and to help chart a path for agriculture to participate in New York State mandated greenhouse gas reduction by all sectors under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act of 2019, otherwise known as the CLCPA. Jennifer will be speaking on opportunities for New York Ag for mitigation, resilience, and adaptation. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Wightman. Thank you, Jenny.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. And I have a lot to share with you. I'm going to talk first about the sources. Elizabeth talked a bit about that. The sources of greenhouse gases from agriculture, the global warming potential and why that's important, it's a key word. Evaluating some greenhouse gas reduction practices in New York State, focusing on real, permanent, and net greenhouse gas accounting, as well as quantification or measurability and verifiability. And then focusing on 5 strategies that we might prioritize in New York State. So what are the sources of agricultural greenhouse gas emissions? Elizabeth showed you this slide. What I want to point out first, though, is this pie chart. This pie chart shows that most of the emissions comes from energy, right? The electricity, the transportation, the home heating fuel. So most of society has to think about fossil fuel-based CO2 emissions. And you can see agriculture is less than 10% of the total. So when you look at this 10% red, it's now pulled out in this bar chart of this agricultural soil management, enteric fermentation, manure management being the 3 primary sources of greenhouse gases. Now, the reason I want to point this out is that, as Elizabeth said, the agricultural soil management is all nitrous oxide emissions. Enteric fermentation and manure management is methane and some nitrous oxide emissions from the manure management. My point here is that while the rest of society needs to think about CO2, when we think about agricultural systems, especially in a dairy heavy state like ours, we have to think about methane and nitrous oxide because carbon dioxide is relatively small. So key point number 1, methane and nitrous oxide are the 2 most important emission sources on New York dairy farms or New York farms. So if you're thinking about what you need to prioritize on the farm level, if you're a crop farmer, you should definitely focus on your nitrous oxide emissions. If you're a livestock farmer, you should focus on your enteric or the burping emissions from the cows through feed efficiency and your manure management. Now you'll note that energy is counted out in the energy sector. So even though farms are using some energy, right, there's going to be a whole transformation of the energy sector, and that will be embedded. Farm energy use will be embedded in the energy sector, but of course, efficiencies on farms are beneficial. So while most of climate change is caused by very large amounts of fossil fuel combustion, adding very large amounts of CO2 to the atmosphere, agriculture needs to focus on methane and nitrous oxide. And it's not that agriculture produces all that much methane and nitrous oxide, like the quantitative amount. It's that methane and nitrous oxide happen to be very potent greenhouse gases. And so what do I mean by that? different greenhouse gases have different abilities to cause climate change. And there are two dominant factors on how potent a greenhouse gas is: how long it lives in the atmosphere, its lifespan, and how effective it is in trapping heat. And so to account for these differences, scientists have created a factor called the global warming potential, or the GWP. And it is a measure of the total energy that a gas absorbs in the atmosphere over a period of time, usually 100 years, relative to the emission of 1 ton of carbon dioxide. So after you apply this factor to these differently potent gases, the common unit is called a carbon dioxide equivalent, or a CO2e or CO2eq. So on the left, you can see the different greenhouse gases, and on the right, you'll see the most common global warming potential factors. This comes from a 2007 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. And in this report, methane is 25 times as potent of a greenhouse gas than CO2, and nitrous oxide is 298 times as potent of a greenhouse gas. However, New York State has chosen to use a different global warming potential. They're using a more recent IPCC report that came out in 2013, and they're using a 20-year timescale. And in this 20-year timescale, methane is now 84 times as potent as carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is still close to 300. So methane and nitrous oxide are potent greenhouse gases, so a small change in these emission sources add up quickly, resulting in a large impact on the inventory. So this is an inventory that was done by New York State in 2019 and refers to 2016 data. And I'm just going to use this as a frame of reference to see how this is the old inventory. This is not the current CLCPA inventory. You can see that agriculture contributes 4% out of our total emissions in the state in this case. Oops. And so 4% of 206 million metric tons is about 8 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. And I just want you to remember this old number using the old global warming potentials, 8 million metric tons. So the CLCPA was passed in 2019. It is regulating greenhouse gas emissions, and it applies to all sectors. So it applies to New York City apartment buildings, right? My apartment building has a score of 80 out of 100. We have a B minus. It applies to transportation, industry, farms. It applies to all of us. And it stipulates a 40% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030 and an 85% reduction by 2050, with net neutrality also by 2050. So I just want to read some of the language. You don't really have to pay too much attention, but I just want to get everybody hearing this language that is in the CLCPA. So the state is to put rules in place to ensure compliance around 2023, and it's designed to minimize costs and maximize total benefits to New York. That these greenhouse gas reductions that are achieved are real, permanent, quantifiable, and verifiable, and do not result in net increase in co-pollutant emissions and minimize leakage. I'm not going to talk about all of those terms, but I just want you to hear those words because we all need to start focusing on learning and understanding these words. Now, the net neutrality by 2050 results in a 15% of offsets by other activity. And in the CLCPA, an offset means a deduction of 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalents that is reduced, avoided, or sequestered by a greenhouse gas emission offset project relative to a baseline. And this also needs to be real, additional, verifiable, enforceable, and permanent. So for example, a greenhouse gas reduction to compensate for emission elsewhere, right? We need jet fuel, we don't have a jet fuel alternative. Maybe we can sequester more carbon in our forests because we've got wonderful forests here in New York State. And so forests would be considered an offset to the emissions from using jet fuel. So what are our emissions from New York agriculture? So in 2020, Peter Woodbury and I began a project for the New York State DEC to create an inventory for the New York State agriculture. And we used the 2019 refinement to the IPCC guidelines. And basically, I'm showing you here the emissions, right? So we estimate that livestock emissions are about 13 million metric tons. Manure management is about 6 million metric tons. And the nitrous oxide emissions from nitrogen use is about 2.2 million metric tons. So for a total of 21 million metric tons. These other emissions refer to pesticide, energy use, things like that, that are outside of farm accounting. So I showed you previously a previous estimate of 8.3 million metric tons from New York State agriculture in the 2019 report. And so you can see that the global warming potential, the 20-year global warming potential that makes methane 84 times more potent of a greenhouse gas, has resulted pretty much in a doubling from 8 to 21 million metric tons, right? So it's not that we've produced more since 2016, it's that the way that we're doing our accounting has changed. Okay, so now we've got these 21 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents that we're emitting. What are we going to do about it? Well, our project for the DEC and what Peter Woodbury and I have been continually working on is how do we reduce these greenhouse gases in a very meaningful way? So I want to just talk about some key terms: real, permanent, quantifiable, and verifiable. There are others, but these are the 4 that I'm going to focus on for today. Real seems like a simple word, but actually it's pretty complicated when you get into the accounting. So real means the quantified greenhouse gas reductions must represent actual emission reduction. That means if it's 100 metric tons this year, it needs to be 99 next year. And that 99 needs to continue in perpetuity, right? And then, you know, you're seeing actual reductions in your total emissions. So did you count your net greenhouse gases? Did you count your nitrous oxide emissions and your methane emissions alongside of your carbon sequestration? Negative, right? The carbon sequestration is pulling the carbon dioxide out, but maybe there's nitrous oxide that is emitted alongside of that, which can counteract. Did you gather a baseline before you implemented your practice to ensure your change made a real difference? Did you sample sufficiently to ensure your new practice made these net gains? Did you game the system by taking stuff away from one area and putting it into another area that you're looking at? There's a lot of components to what makes a mitigation strategy real. The point is, real mitigation quantitatively reduces our total emissions meaningfully. It's a real reduction to stop climate change, and it's a really important term. So I just am going to share, Peter Woodbury and some colleagues came up with a fast GHG tool. There's the link here, and I can drop it later, which is looking at net greenhouse gas emissions. And so in one scenario in New York, no-till reduces net greenhouse gas emissions. And what's happening here is there's a small amount to the right means a reduction, and to the left means an emission. And you can see there's some soil organic carbon that's being sequestered, and that's great. And you can also see, because you're doing no tillage, you have less tractor passes, which means you have less fossil fuel use. And so these two minus this results in this net benefit. But in a non-legume cover crop, sometimes it can increase your net greenhouse gases, in part because you might need to use more fuel in order to put in the cover crop. You might get larger amounts of organic carbon, but you might also have larger amounts of nitrous oxide emissions for a non-beneficial net greenhouse gas mitigation. That all being said, like, soil health is essential, as everything Elizabeth has just said about water infiltration and resiliency, maintaining fertile soils for future generations. There's all kinds of reasons to have soil health practices. And it doesn't need, right? It's not really the problem here. It's a very important thing that we have to support with or without it being a net greenhouse gas benefit. So yeah, permanent. Permanent is because climate change is a problem of hundreds of years. And so we have to ask ourselves, is this mitigation practice permanent or is it reversible? And if it is reversible, right, the world is cycling, on what time scale is it reversible? And so I have sort of a tongue-in-cheek kind of an example over here of a bottle of soda. So say there's a Pennsylvania company that seals the bubbles of CO2 into a can of soda. And then they sell it to a New Yorker who opens that bottle of soda and releases that CO2. This is both temporary and reversible carbon sequestration, right? Like while it's in the bottle, it's not in the atmosphere. So can Pennsylvania count this as a reduction in their inventory? And does New York count this as an emission? My point here is three. We have to think about the boundary of the accounting. We have to think about the permanence of the carbon sequestration, and we have to think about the timescale of that permanence. So carbon sequestration is simply the removal of carbon from the atmosphere through biological or physical means. We all know photosynthetically, we can add carbon to the soil by the roots and add carbon to the forest stock. We can also mechanically remove timber from the forest and add carbon to our houses so that it's long lived in our houses and our beautiful furniture. Or we can compress carbon dioxide mechanically and store it in old oil wells. And my favorite carbon sequestration is every bit of fossil fuel we leave in the ground. So we can harvest biomass for energy and cycle surface carbon instead of pulling out this ancient fossil fuel carbon. Or we can have other renewables like wind, solar, and geothermal. Or we can all have energy efficient homes like Elizabeth's net zero home or more efficient vehicles that we're using. All of these things that we can do that can keep fossils in the ground is the greatest carbon sequestration opportunity we have. Carbon is the currency of life, right? I just had some wonderful orange juice and a yogurt this morning for breakfast. And I am going to turn that carbon over while I'm speaking to you, right? We need to have carbon being mobile and moving, right? Just because carbon can come out of soils or carbon comes out of the heat that comes from your home, we need to activate carbon. My point here is that carbon has different lifespans in different places. In soil, it can last 1 to 30 years. In the forest, it can last 1 year if we burn it, or hundreds of years if we don't burn it, or hundreds of years and more if we take some wood products out and we put them into our furniture. And again, fossil fuels represent millions of years of carbon. So because carbon sequestration is only as good as its permanence, and because climate change is a long game, soil carbon is very important for soil health, but it provides modest greenhouse gas benefits because of permanence. For now, focus on former ag lands, on afforestation, and focus on woodlands on farms. 20% of US farmland is wooded, so there's some great opportunities to sequester carbon there. Quantifiable. Can the mitigation be sufficiently detected and measured? Have you gathered a baseline? What are the frequency of measurements? Do you do it annually for soils for the next 30 years? Do you do decadally for trees? What are the number of measurements that you need to take to track those changes? And where are the locations of those measurements? Are they randomized? Are they categorized? And how much effort does it take to quantify your impact? Can you see that the forest stand is still there and is growing healthy? Or is it easy to see what the soil carbon is? Right, those are two very different things and they take different effort in order to quantify. Verifiable. The greenhouse gas reduction must result from practices whose performance can readily and accurately be quantified, monitored, and verified. So how appropriate are the tests that you have for accounting? Or how expensive are the tests? How easy are the tests for analysis and reporting? Who does the verification? Do you hire a third-party verifier? Do they have insurance? Do you have insurance? How rigorous is the verification? Do you take direct samples and you measure annually, or are you using a lookup table or a black box model? And then at the end of the day, since we're all in this together, who is held accountable? Are the verifiers held accountable? Are the policymakers held accountable? Are the farmers held accountable, right? Are the consumers held accountable? So remember that the goal is to reduce our total GHG. And I know that I've just set out some pretty rigorous standards, but we have a real thing that we need to deal with. And unlike the rest of society, which needs to think about how to get its energy in other ways, biological systems like agriculture have much more complex things to think through in order to get real, permanent, and verifiable mitigation. And farmers are the most vulnerable to a changing climate. And so we should be very invested in not just farms having real, permanent, and verifiable mitigation, but all of society, so that the reductions come down, climate becomes stabilized. So when evaluating a change in practice, a baseline must be set, and all three greenhouse gases must be counted together to ensure that any change in practice results in a net reduction. And that these practices should result in real, permanent, and verifiable reductions to ensure society is meaningfully achieving climate stabilization. Okay, so now that I've got those rules in place, how do we reduce our total emissions? Remember, so this is just a diagram I pulled off this morning, right? You can see all these different practices. Some emit methane and nitrous oxide, some emit just methane and nitrous oxide, or just CO2, right? There's all these different combinations. Some are sequestering into the soil and some are emitting or respiring. Well, there's 5 broad categories to mitigate greenhouse gases on farms. First, if you're producing methane, figure out ways to capture it and flare it. You can even use it as a renewable energy source. You can increase your efficiency, meaning you are more efficient, like Elizabeth was talking about how to reduce your nitrogen use. You can improve your feed efficiency. Less food into the cow means less manure that you have to manage and less manure emissions, but also less enteric or burping emissions from the cows, and often higher milk production. Displace fossil fuels. Can you produce renewables on your farm? Can you replace concrete and steel, which are really energy intensive and greenhouse gas intensive emitting products, with wood products for building materials? Can you sequester carbon in trees, biochar, and long-lived wood products? And can you conserve energy and natural resources, reduce food waste, and leave forests as forests? So this is the same thing again, but focusing on types of farming practices. So for dairy, really a focus on feed management and manure storage are the key areas to focus on. In crops, thinking about relationships between soil carbon and nitrogen to maximize your soil carbon sequestration and minimize your nitrous oxide emissions. Woodlands, think about, improve forest management or consider agroforestry, where you're growing alley crops in with your other crops. Think about how to use your idle lands better. So think about how you might start growing trees on areas that didn't have trees recently. You can start installing solar or wind, or growing biomass for feed and fuel to displace fossil fuels, and of course, conserving. So the goal of our research, meaning Peter and my research, is to determine effective practices for agriculture to mitigate greenhouse gases. And we're also thinking about how land managers and policymakers need to accomplish multiple goals. So how do we think about all these goals side by side? We came up with something called the Smart Decision Matrix. It's a riff on some kind of business model thing. But basically, we gave 5 letters: services or co-benefits. Measurable, is it a measurable thing that we can do? Can we quantify this greenhouse gas reduction? How much would it cost to achieve the greenhouse gas reduction? How realistic is it to implement? And what is the time frame of implementation? So when I say services, what are the co-benefits or ecosystem services by implementing a given greenhouse gas mitigating practice? Does it have soil health benefits? Does it improve community relationships? Does it improve adaptation to climate change? Does it have profitability benefits, air quality, water quality, right? There's lots of things that happen in a change of practice, and we want to make sure that we're advocating for these co-benefits while we're advocating for greenhouse gas reductions. Measurable. Is this something that would be quantitatively large for the state to pursue, and would it be verifiable so that it can fall within the state's regulatory regime of trying to get us our emissions down for our state? Is it achievable? How much does it cost to do? But there are also many other kinds of costs. Cost to educate and administer, cost to implement and maintain. How realistic is it? How many acres do you need to engage? Is it 2 stakeholders, or is it 2,000 stakeholders that need to be engaged? Are there technically available tools? Can we do it now, or do we need more research? And what is the time frame? What is the lifespan of this infrastructure? What are the time limits on the mitigation strategy? What are the short and long-term effectivenesses of this practice? And basically what we're also thinking about here is how permanent is this practice? So we use the SMART matrix, and we would just give a star. Basically, it's pretty simple. You give a star if it has a co-benefit, significant co-benefits, etc. And we evaluated 13 practices that are listed over here. And our top 5 mitigation practices came within, my timer says I'm at 25 minutes, so I'm gonna quit very soon. Our top 5 mitigation practices either cost nothing or save money, or were up to $75 per metric ton mitigated. They represented real and permanent mitigation, and most could be directly verified. They all had a suite of wonderful co-benefits, and many increased production and efficiency of New York agriculture. The top 5 were livestock feed management, manure cover and flare, nitrogen use efficiency, improved management of woodlands, and planting trees on idle lands. So I'm going to take you back to the beginning now. This was our inventory, right? We estimated 21 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents being emitted, right? These are our emissions from agriculture. Now, if we improve our feed efficiency, which is something we think we can do, we can reduce 2.3 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents. If we used a cover and flare system, we could reduce 4.3 million metric tons. And if we improved our end use efficiency, we would result in around 7 million metric tons. And I think this is feasible by 2030. This is a 30% reduction in our current sector emissions. Now, if we add afforestation, right? So the other 2 topics that were great were afforestation and improved farm woodlands. We haven't done this estimate for woodlands yet, but for afforestation, we estimate 5 million metric tons of CO2 equivalents will be mitigated if we planted trees on about 1.7 million acres of idle land in the state. Combined with our emissions reductions, right, these would be offsets, forest offsets, we result in a 55% reduction in our current emissions. Now, we have to remember that the CLCPA goals are actually below the 1990 numbers, so it's kind of a bummer, right? But when you add our top 4, and we haven't added the woodlands yet, if you add our top 4 together and you make this reduction relative to 1990 emissions, we can achieve almost the 40% that is required by the CLCPA for 2030. It's not always going to happen by 2030, but we need to get those things in place in order for this mitigation to fulfill. There are tons of existing programs in the state already to help us. We need to build out future programs. Just a reality check, we have serious goals, we have limited time, we have limited money, we have to figure out how to leverage what we're already doing to just make small considerations for how we can address the greenhouse gas emissions on behalf of the whole society. And it's not just agriculture. All of us depend on agriculture, so how can we help reduce the pressure on agriculture as citizens? If we think about 1 acre of land, and we have a finite number of acres of land in this state, right? We have all these inputs which have greenhouse gases associated that we apply to this 1 acre of land to achieve a whole different variety of products, right? And then we have to process these products, then we use them, and then we waste them or we recycle them. But what if the processing and product point was 20% more efficient? Could we use 10% less land and all of those inputs? What if you and I reduced our food waste by 50%, our edible food waste? How would that impact the inputs and the land required to do so? And then finally, it's not just agriculture. I have a 700 square foot apartment in New York City. It's 7 stories high. So basically I have a 100 square foot footprint in New York State. And my building is going to have its first fine for energy inefficiency in 2030 of $1,000 a year for the whole building, and $50,000 fine in 2035. I don't know if I just said 2050. So $1,000 in 2030, $50,000 in 2035. The point is, everything my building does to reduce its energy consumption reduces all of the solar panels that need to be applied to some land area upstate, which has an impact on agriculture. So everything that you and I do to reduce our energy consumption ultimately is a land use decision. And I just encourage us all to keep that in mind. So methane and nitrous oxide are important. When evaluating a change in practice, you should set a baseline. You should count all 3 greenhouse gases together to ensure net greenhouse gas mitigation. Not all strategies are equal. Focus on those that are real, permanent, and verifiable. Farms are sensitive to changing climate, so everything we do today is the most, it's the best adaptation strategy for future farmers, right? Every reduction we do today makes a more stable climate for the future. I believe we can meet our 2030 goals here in New York State with some effort, but I think we have the capacity. We just need the will. And I think the 2050 goals are going to take serious research, imagination, and social commitment. But we have time to improve our research, improve our understanding and our communication and our commitment. And I think we can figure that out too. I want to thank you all. I welcome questions. If you have any questions for me afterwards, these are our email accounts. We've been supported by a lot of great organizations. These are some key references. And there's a talk coming up on livestock on the 18th, and a talk about forests and greenhouse gases on the 16th, if you're interested. And now I will stop and we can take questions.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. There were a few questions in the chat. So let's see here. What about burning wood versus fuel oil? That was from Paul Salem. That was from earlier in your presentation.
Okay, so under the CLCPA, and I don't really understand it quite yet. Combustion is really not being allowed. In my perspective, burning wood in a super efficient system, either in a super efficient electric generating system, right, that could heat pumps, support heat pumps, or in a super efficient boiler situation. In principle, that is recycling surface carbon as opposed to pulling up fossil fuel carbon to do the same work. And when you are removing those trees from the forest area, you are opening, in order to heat your home or whatever, you are opening up the forest canopy so that more trees can grow in that place and sequester the carbon again. So there's some accounting issues around and some legal issues about air quality concerns around combusting wood. But I think we're working towards that. And I think this is ripe for discussion, larger social discussion. But there are equity concerns with air quality around combustion in general. And that's why there's this limitation in CLCPA.
Okay, thanks. We do have, we'll just have one more question here, which was a couple people asked about it. Can you speak to grass-fed grazed cows and enteric fermentation greenhouse gas production, how this differs from non-pastured cows?
Oh, that's a killer question. And I truly can't answer it in the way that I want to be able to answer it. So pasture-fed cows are great because you're reducing all of the, pesticides for the corn and all of the tractor passes and things like that. But what's complicated is actually New York State dairy, which is not a high percentage of pasture, is incredibly efficient because the feed efficiency is actually reducing the methane emissions per unit of milk produced. And so actually I haven't done the quantitative comparison, so I can't give you a quantitative number on it. But my guess is that the grass-fed might result in greater net emissions simply because methane is so potent, not because grass-fed isn't a very viable thing in society. That all being said, if you remember the very first pie chart, where most of the emissions are coming from fossil fuel combustion and only 10% is coming from agriculture, right? At some point, we're going to have to choose our priorities. And frankly, I think it's okay that cows burp. I mean, we all burp, right? Like this is part of livingness, right? There are things we can control and there are things we can't control. We can control our fossil fuel consumption. There are ways to improve feed efficiency in animals, but they're also living beings and they deserve their own space to exist. So I sort of punted there, and I've also punted on carbon credits because the conditions of the CLCPA make me uncomfortable to talk about carbon credits, and I'm trying to learn more about how carbon credits are going to work. But I hope that was an okay answer. I can't tell you. I suspect grass-fed is actually more emissions, results in more emissions, unfortunately. But I don't know.
Well,
right?
thank you.
I mean,
yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated issue. So
it's complicated. Lots of inputs, lots of outputs.
Yes.
And the global warming potential makes everything even more shifty.
That's true. So I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That's all we have time for now.